Hey, I'm Mike with Codecademy, and in this video, I'm going to be walking you through the Simple Calculator project in Android. So in order to start this project, you're going to want to open Android Studio. Now, this entire project is going to take place on your actual computer, so your computer, not on the Codecademy platform. So step one is we're going to open up Android Studio, and we're going to start a new Android Studio project. You're going to click on Empty Activity, Next, and then let's name this Simple Calculator, and then we can click Finish. So once that's loaded up, you'll see here that it's opened up the main.activity.java file and the main.activity.xml file. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually build out the user interface. So we're going to add in all of the UI elements that we want into our app, and then once all those UI elements are in, we'll go into the code and we'll actually write some logic around those. So first things first, we can actually just delete this hello world that's there by default. So you can just click it over here and delete. We are going to keep the constraint layout though. So the first thing we'll do with this calculator is we're going to add in some input boxes. We're going to want the user to be able to input the numbers that they want to perform calculations on. So they can input two numbers into two different text boxes, and then they can add or subtract or eventually maybe do some other operations as well. Now, Android by default is going to provide us with an input box that we can use for numbers. So if you come over here and you click on text, and then you come down here to number, you're going to just do the normal number one, and you can drag and drop this over here. So you'll see here that this edit text ends up going inside of the constraint layout, and it's a number. And that means that the Android operating system is going to limit the user's keyboard so that they can only have numbers. And that's just going to help us. That way we don't get any letter inputs or any other symbols. Before we do anything else, let's add some constraints. So I'm going to drag some constraints over to each side. So we'll constrain this to the side, and then we'll also constrain this here to the top of the app. And we can move this down a little bit so that it's a bit more visible. Then what we can do is come over here. We're going to give this an ID of number 1. So this is going to be the first number that the user wants to operate on. We'll also go ahead and give this a hint. So we're going to put some hint text in here. We can just put this as enter a number. And this is basically going to show up whenever there's not a number inputted in there. And then if you want, you can also give this a default value. So here, if you come up here to the search bar, we can type in text, and we can give this a default value of 0. You don't have to do that, but it's a good optional step. Now that we have the first input in, we're going to do the same thing, but for the second number input. So there's going to be two numbered inputs. So I'm going to grab another one of these, and I'm going to drag it down. We're going to do something similar with the constraints. So I'm going to constrain it to the left side, and I'm also going to constrain it to the right side. And then we'll take this here, and we'll constrain the top to the bottom of this text box, and we can bring that down a little bit. Similarly, we'll come in here, and we can modify the ID. So here I'm going to put this ID as number 2. And then the same thing, we can add in some hint text. So here we'll also say enter a number. And then for the text, we can come over here. And again, we can put a default value of 0, or you can put whatever default value you want. You don't even have to put a default value. So now that our two number inputs are in, the user will be able to input two numbers that they can then add, subtract, or do whatever operations they want. The next thing we want to do is allow the user to choose which operation they want to perform. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you could go about doing this. The way that we're going to do it here, though, is by using radio buttons. Radio buttons are special types of buttons. It's a grouping of buttons where you can only select one single option. And that's good for this because we only want the user to be able to select one operation. If you go over here to buttons, and then you come down here to radio group, you can drag and drop a radio group right below this second input. Then I'm going to add some constraints. So I'm going to constrain it to the left. I'm also going to constrain it to the right. And then we'll constrain it to the bottom of that second input, and we can move it down a little bit. Radio groups are a little bit hard to work with because they're so small, and they're also invisible. This is basically a container where we can put radio buttons, and it'll control the functionality where you can only select one radio button at a time. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add two radio buttons for the two operations that we're going to support: addition and subtraction. So here, come over to radio button, and you're actually just going to drag, and you can drop this right here inside the radio group on the side menu. So I'm going to drop one in, and then I'm going to drop another one in. So now I have two radio buttons, and you can see that they're spread out just like that. So these are going to represent those two operations, like I said, addition and subtraction. So let's click on that first one, and we're going to change the ID to add. So over here, we'll change this to add. This is going to be our add operator. And then if you scroll down and you come here to the text, we're just going to make this a plus sign. So here we go. This is our addition operator. And then over here, click on the radio button 2, the second one that we added in. And this is going to be subtract. And then over here, we're going to put the subtraction sign, so just a hyphen. So there we go. Now we have our two operations that we can choose from, add and subtract. We're going to want one of these to be selected by default. So click on the radio group over here. And now that it has two radio buttons in it, let's give it an ID of operators. And then if you scroll down, you'll see here we have a checked button option. Click down here and we're going to have add as the default checked option. So that means that this is going to support addition by default. And then if the user clicks on the subtraction option here, then it'll subtract the numbers. So we have our two numbers that get inputted. The user is able to select which operation they want to perform. And then the last thing we want to do is add in an equals button. So the user can click the equals button and then we'll go ahead and calculate the answer. That's the next thing we'll do. So back over here in the buttons tab, we're just going to add in a normal button. So you can put this right below those operators. And once again, I'm going to add constraints. So I'm going to constrain it to both sides, and then I'll also constrain it to the bottom of the operators. And you can play around with these constraints as much as you want. I'm just laying this out in a very simplistic way, but if you want to change the layout, that's totally fine as well. Here we're going to give this an ID of equals because this is going to be the equals button, and we'll give it the text as an equal sign. One thing you might want to do is increase the text size. So you can come up here, and if you just type in text, you'll see we have all these different attributes, all these different options for text. And down here in text size, we'll change it to 36. It's just a little bit bigger and a little bit more readable for the user. So now we have all of the main UI components. The last thing we want to do is create a component where the answer is going to get displayed. So we want to be able to display the actual result of adding or subtracting. Let's come over here to text, and I'm going to add in a text view. And this text view is basically just a view where the user can see some text. So here we're going to give this an ID of result because this is going to be the result of adding or subtracting the two numbers. And by default, this isn't going to have any text in it. So it's just going to be invisible. Now, before you do that, though, let's actually add on some constraints. So here I'm going to constrain it to the left. I'm also going to constrain it to the right. And then I'll constrain it right below the button. And then I'll also constrain it to the bottom here of the screen. So that's all constrained. That's all laid out pretty well. So the UI is actually done being built at this point. Now what we want to do is let's load up our app on the emulator and make sure that everything looks good. So I'm going to come up here to run app, and you'll see here that we have the UI all set up. So you can play around with this a little bit, and you'll actually see that the app is already pretty functional. So you'll see here when we click on these numbered inputs, I can input numbers, but I can't actually input any text. I also can't input decimal numbers. So if I try to input this decimal right here, it doesn't work. Now, if you want, after we finish this version of the project, you can add in support for decimal numbers and all of that. But just to keep it simple, we're only using ints at this point. So these two numbers inputs work. We can input numbers. We can also select between the different operations, and we can hit this equals button right here. So by default, we actually have a lot of functionality just baked into these components that Android's providing. But what we want to do now is actually add in the functionality in our Java code. So I'm going to come back over here to Android Studio, and in mainActivity.java, this is where we're going to be writing all of the code to make this thing functional. And the first step whenever we're building an app like this is we want to get access to all of those UI components. So I have all these UI components, these text boxes, and this equals button. I want to be able to access those inside of my Java code. So how do we do that? Well, we can create variables for them. We can store each one of those UI components in variables, and then we can manipulate them and do things with them. So let's start with those number boxes. I'm going to create a variable for the first number box. This is going to be a final. It's going to be a final because I'm not going to change this. Once we grab that component, I'm going to keep it in the same variable. It's never going to get modified. It's an edit text component. So if you look over here in activity main, you'll see here that these numbers are edit text. That's the data type. So you see that's over here, it's an edit text. So that's the data type that we want to store. And you'll see here that Android's saying that we need to import this. So if you just come over here Android Studio should give you the option, if you type it out and I hit enter here, it'll automatically import it for me. So you'll see up here that edit text got imported. But if that doesn't happen, then you can just write out import android.widget.edit text. So we've imported edit text. I'm going to call this first number, and I'm going to set this equal to that first number component. So how do we get that component from the UI? We're going to use a method called findViewById, and this method is going to take a numerical ID of the component that we want to grab. The problem is, though, that we don't have access directly to those numerical IDs. We gave this number box an ID of number 1, but that actually gets converted into an integer. And so the way we can get that integer is we can say r.id.number1. And so this is going to give us the numerical representation of that ID that we set on the first number box. So at this point, that text box, that edit text, that numerical text box should be stored inside of this first number variable. We're going to do exactly the same thing for the second one. So you can literally just copy and paste. We're going to call this second number, and over here we're going to put number 2. So now we have both of those text boxes here in our code, and we're going to repeat this process for all of the UI components. So next we're going to grab that radio group. So over here, if I just start typing in radio, you'll see down here we have an option for radio group. So if I enter here, then Android Studio will automatically import radio group for me. We're going to call this operators, and once again we're going to find the view by ID, r.id, and it's operators. And then we'll repeat the process for the add and the subtract radio buttons. So here I'll say final radio button. We're going to call this add, and that's going to be find view by ID, r.id.add. And then we'll do the same thing for subtract. So down here, we'll just copy and paste. And this is going to be subtract. Then we're going to grab the equals button. So that's just going to be a normal button. And once again, that'll get automatically imported for us by Android Studio. We're going to call that equals, and we'll find the view by ID, r.id.equals. And then for the last thing, it's going to be that text view. So it's going to be a text view. And remember, this was called result. Make sure that gets imported. Find view by ID, r.id.result. So at this point, we have all of those UI components. This one, these, the equals button, and the text view. All of those are now inside of our code. So we would call this hooking into the UI. So we're hooking up the UI now with our Java code. And so we can actually start writing some logic. We can start adding in some functionality, which is going to be really useful. So the next thing we want to do is we want to start building in the logic. Now, all the operations in this app are going to take place when the user hits this equals button. So when the user clicks the equals button, we're going to grab both of these numbers out of these text boxes. We're going to check to see which operation the user wants to perform, and then we're going to perform that operation on those numbers and display it here in the text view. So all that gets triggered when the equals button gets clicked. So why don't we first just set that up? So we're going to set it up so that we can run some code when the equals button gets clicked. So over here, to do that, I can say equals.setOnClickListener. And you'll see here that Android Studio automatically is pulling this up for me. It says setOnClickListener. Now what you can do is you can just hit enter right here, and Android Studio should fill that in. Now the code that goes inside of this parentheses is going to require us to create a new onClickListener object. So in here, we're going to say new, and we're going to create a view.onClickListener. And this onClickListener is actually going to be a new class. So over here, we're going to create curly brackets, and then in here, we're going to override a method from this superclass. So I'm going to say override, and then down here, we're going to override public void onClickView. We'll call that v. And then in here, this method is going to get executed anytime that equals button gets clicked. So what's our next step? Well, the next step is we want to be able to get the numbers that are stored inside of the first number and the second number input boxes. So if we go back over here to our app, you'll see here we have our two input boxes. When I hit enter, I want to be able to get these numbers. So if I put like a 65 in here, when I click enter, I want to be able to access that 65. So how can we do that? Well, the simplest way is we could just say, for example, first number dot get text. And if we want to get that as a string, we could say toString. So this right here is going to give us the string representation of whatever is inside of that text box. But here's the problem. We're getting a string back, but we want to be able to perform an addition or a subtraction operation on this. And we can't add or subtract strings together. We can only add or subtract numbers together. So as a second step, we're going to want to convert whatever this text is into a number. Now remember, we're using this number input, so the user can only input numbers, which means this string is technically a number. It's just in a string format. So to do that, we can say integer, and we can say integer.parseInt, and then inside of parentheses, we're going to put the string that we got out of that text box. And so now this whole thing is actually going to return an integer, and we can store that integer inside of a variable. So let's create a final int, and we're going to call it first number value, and we're going to set that equal to the result of parsing the integer out of that text box. So now this is an integer that is the first number that the user entered. We're going to do the same thing for the second number. So you can literally just copy and paste this code down. We're going to call it second number value. We'll change this to second number, and it should do the same thing. So now we have both of our numbers, and we could perform, for example, an addition or a subtraction operation on them. So that's the first big step. Now the second step is to figure out which operation the user wants to perform, whether it's addition or subtraction. And what we need to do is we need to figure out which one of these radio buttons is checked. So how do we do that? Well, we can use the operators variable over here. So remember, the operators, that's that radio group container. That's the container that's holding both of our radio buttons. And there's actually a method here on this operators variable, which is called getCheckedRadioButtonID. So what this is going to do is it's going to return for us the integer value of the ID of the button, either add or subtract, that is currently selected. So remember, this is going to be an integer value, and it's the integer value that is in r.id.add or r.id.subtract. So why don't we take this ID and we're going to store it in a variable. I'll call it operator button ID. And remember, this is going to be an integer, so we'll make this a final int operator button ID, and we'll set that equal to operators.getCheckedRadioButtonID. So operator button ID is an integer that has either r.id.add or r.id.subtract in it. Those are the only two possible values. So now that we have that, we can just use a simple if statement to check which operation we need to perform. So over here I can say if, and I can say if operator button ID is equal to the ID of the add button, then we'll do addition, or if it's the subtract button, then we'll do subtraction. So over here I could say r.id.add. So if it's equal to that, then down here we'll do addition, and then over here I could say else we'll do subtraction. Now I could also say else if operator button ID is equal to r.id.subtract. But because we only have two operations, it's actually not necessary, because if it's not the addition ID, then it must be the subtraction ID, because those are the only two options. And so now all it's left to do is add or subtract those numbers. So why don't we create another integer? I'm going to call this int. We'll call it answer, and I'm not actually going to initialize it with a value. Down here, we're going to say answer is equal to first number value plus second number value. And in the subtraction case, we're going to say answer is equal to first number value minus second number value. Now, I'll also add in a tidbit here. We can use r.id.add. We could also do add.getID. The two of those are equivalent. They're going to give us the same exact answer. It's just up here we're using r.id.add because we don't actually have the component yet. Whereas down here we have the component, so we could just get the ID directly. But they're doing exactly the same thing. So we've performed the correct operations, either addition or subtraction. And now down here, all that's left to do is display this. So remember, we have over here this result text view. And so this is what's going to actually contain the answer. So down here we can say result.setText. And then inside of here, we could say answer.toString. Now you'll notice here that I'm getting an error when I try to do .toString. And the reason is because int is a built-in type. So it's not actually an object, so it doesn't have the toString method. So over here, we could just say integer answer. And then over here, you'll see that we get that toString option. So all this looks good to me. Why don't we go ahead and test this? So I'm just gonna restart the app, and then over here, we'll rerun it. So now I'm gonna type in up here, why don't we do 3, and then down here, we'll do an 8, and I'll add them. And then now when I click enter, you'll see down here that we get 11. So it's a little bit small. Why don't we come in here, and in the result text box, we'll come down and we'll change the text size. So once again, I can just search for text. Text size, we'll change this to 36. And then why don't we rerun the app? So let's try this again. Why don't we do 99 and 2, and we'll subtract them. Now I'm going to hit enter, so we should get 97. You'll see there that 97 pops up. So there you have it. We have a functioning calculator where we can do both addition and subtraction operations.